How is it going, guys? We have got a big one today. We are going to be replacing the clutch in my FRS. There's a couple reasons why you would want to do this. One, your stock clutch may be worn out and starting to slip. Or two, you're going to be adding a significant amount of power to the car, more than the clutch is rated for. So you need to upgrade it so you don't get any slippage. Now we've got an XClutch Sprung ceramic clutch kit today. If you guys aren't familiar with XClutch, they make a bunch of different clutch kits for a wide variety of cars. And they range from OE replacements all the way up to a twin disc setup that's rated for, I think, 1,350 foot-pounds of torque, which is absolutely ridiculous. This kit is rated for 442 foot-pounds of torque, which is still way more than this car makes, so it should be able to take whatever I throw at it. Now, along with the clutch, we're also going to be installing a couple of other things. We've got the Verus engineering clutch fork and pivot point, because the stock ones have a habit of breaking when you upgrade to a more aggressive pressure plate. We've got some transmission fluid from Motul because we're going to be draining the transmission before we take it off of the car, so we need to refill it with some new fluid. And I've also got a bunch of new OEM hardware to replace what is currently on the car. So we've got everything to install the clutch here. Let's jump over to the car and get started. First thing we're gonna do is disconnect the battery, and I'm actually gonna be removing the battery as well just to give us a little bit more space. Just need a 10mm socket and ratchet for this. If we take a look on top of the engine behind the intake manifold, you're gonna see the slave cylinder that's held in with two 14mm bolts. Go ahead and remove those. I'm gonna take this, set it out of the way. Next to that slave cylinder that we just removed, you're gonna see this 12mm bolt that's holding the ground wire in place, and these two connectors that we need to disconnect. We're gonna disconnect the starter next. So you can see this black connection on the back. You just need to squeeze the tab on the top to pull that out. And then there is a 12mm nut under this rubber cover that we need to remove. From the top of the engine, we have access to two of the Bellhousing bolts. These are 14mm bolts. This is the one on the driver's side, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove these while we're up here. The one on the passenger side is actually one of the bolts that's holding the starter in place. It's this one right here. A little tricky to get to because you've got the big wiring harness and some piping to work around, but you should be able to sneak in there and get to it. Underneath the car, there's a couple things we need to do before we can get that transmission out. The first one being the under panels. There's a metal one up front and a felt one underneath the transmission that's just held in with some 12 and 10mm bolts and pop clips. Once those are out of the way, we need to remove the middle section of the exhaust to make some room. So that being the front pipe and the mid pipe to your catback. And then we can move on to the drive shaft, disconnect the shifter linkage, and remove the transmission mount. We do also need to drain the transmission before we take this out. This is not completely necessary as long as you have something to plug where the drive shaft went in, but I need to do a transmission fluid flush anyway, so we're gonna be draining that, and then we can move on to those Bellhousing bolts. Before I pull the drive shaft, we are gonna drain the transmission. If you look on the driver's side, there's two plugs that utilize a 10mm hex key. This top one here is gonna be the fill plug, and then the bottom one is going to be the drain plug. Make sure you've got new gaskets for these, and it's always a good idea to crack open the fill plug first. You don't want to drain your transmission and then figure out you can't open up the fill plug. So let's crack this open. And obviously make sure you've got a pan underneath. With the transmission drain, we can move on to the drive shaft. Before we unbolt it from the rear diff, use a paint marker and make a reference point so we can put this back together how it was. I've already loosened up all 4 of the 14mm nuts and bolts, so I'm just gonna undo these by hand. And then chances are we're gonna need to take a hammer and give this a couple whacks to break it free. Moving towards the middle of the car, there are 2 more 14mm bolts that are holding the drive shaft in place. Once we have these removed, we can pull the drive shaft towards the back of the car and out of the transmission. Make sure you've got some sort of drip tray underneath where the drive shaft inserts into the transmission, just in case any leftover transmission fluid comes out. Drive shaft is out, we've got a transmission jack in place, so now we can move on to the transmission mount. We're pretty much going to be removing all of these bolts and nuts besides the one in the middle, unless you're installing some sort of insert. And then I'm also going to remove the front pipe bracket that's just held in with 2 12mm bolts just to get it out of the way. We're gonna remove these 2 nuts next. We've got the shifter next. You can see that I've pulled the rubber boot down to reveal this section here. There is a cotter pin that we need to remove and a small black washer on the end as well, so don't forget that. Then we can pull this out like so. And we'll move on to the shifter carriage. There's gonna be 2 pins that we need to remove, one on each side of the transmission. If you follow the arms back, there's gonna be one right here and one right here. We need to basically rotate the ends of those pins to release them and allow us to pull them out. To get these pins out, you wanna get a flathead screwdriver or some sort of pick tool underneath this portion here, and we're gonna rotate it out this way, and then we can slide them out. With that, the only things left that should be holding that transmission in place are the bell housing bolts and nuts. There's a total of 8 of them. We've already removed 2 from the top, so there's 6 remaining. I'm gonna start with the one on the passenger side that's holding the starter, so we can get that out of the way and then take care of the rest. You can see that I have a stand with a block of wood underneath that oil pan, and that is to help prevent the engine from pitching forward once we get this transmission off of the car. And that's gonna help when we go to reinstall the transmission to make sure everything is level and we don't run into any issues trying to get things lined up. I do not like how this bolt feels. Well, this turned into a really fun job because this feels like it got cross-threaded or the threads are just galled up. Let's look how bad the damage is. Oh yeah. Get the starter out. Okay, we have got all of the bolts and nuts off now. So we just need to wriggle the transmission free from the engine. May need the use of a pry bar just to help us out. There we go. That is one transmission off of the car. Here's the clutch disc in all of its glory. This, I believe, is the stock clutch. There are 6 bolts holding the pressure plate in place. Once we have those removed, we can take that off along with the clutch disc, and then we have access to the flywheel bolts that we can take off as well, and then the flywheel itself. I'm gonna be zapping these bolts off with an impact. If you are using hand tools, you're gonna need a way to stop the engine from spinning. You can either jam something into the teeth of the flywheel, or you can use a 22mm socket and breaker bar on the crankshaft pulley bolt and have somebody hold that while you break these loose. There we are. Now we can install the new flywheel. Make sure you've cleaned it off with some brake clean to get all the shipping oils off. We'll get everything lined up, and then we're going to get the included flywheel bolts with some Loctite on them. I've also pressed in the pilot bearing. Just gonna tighten these by hand first. Once we've got all the bolts installed, we want to go around in a star pattern and torque these down to 35 foot-pounds. Once they're all torqued to 35, we can torque them to 63 foot-pounds, again in a star pattern to finish it off. We're gonna install the clutch disc next using the alignment tool that is provided. Make sure you've got it orientated correctly. And the pressure plate goes on next. Same thing as the flywheel with the pressure plate. Make sure that friction material is cleaned off, and then we just need to align the pins. And then we'll get the bolts installed and torqued to spec. Once all those bolts are hand tight all the way around, we can torque them down in a star pattern to whatever the manufacturer suggests. In our case, 26 foot-pounds. Before we reinstall the transmission, we need to install the upgraded clutch fork, pivot point, and the new throw-out bearing. So grab the old one, and we're gonna wriggle it towards the front, like so, and then we can pull it out of the rubber boot. Now we have access to the clutch fork pivot ball that we'll remove with a 19mm socket. And the new one just threads right in. And then we'll want to torque this down to 12 foot-pounds. With the old clutch fork removed, there's a couple spring clips on here that we are going to be taking off because I'm going to be reusing them. One is for the pivot point, and then 2 are for the throw-out bearing. The one for the pivot point is super easy to take out. You just squeeze it in the middle here, and then pull it out like so. And then for these clips, all you need to do is lift up on the end here and get it over that piece. Do the same thing on the other side. And then you'll be able to twist the throw-out bearing out. And then these just come out of the clutch fork like so. And we're gonna clean these up before we reinstall it onto the new clutch fork. Before we get this assembled, we do have a couple areas that we want to grease. On the clutch fork here, you're gonna wanna grease the pivot point area as well as the pivot ball itself. And then we flip this over. You wanna put a little bit of grease on these 2 nubs here that are gonna make contact with the throw-out bearing. and then you want to do the same thing on the throwout bearing. Put a little bit of grease on these two ears that are going to make contact with the clutch fork, and then once you have everything greased, we can put this together. I don't have it greased yet just to keep things clean, but we're going to install the spring clip for the pivot point first. You're going to want this curved end to go inside of that recess. There's a little slot right here that this slides into, and then we're going to pinch this and slide it down until it goes into the two holes at the bottom, like that. For the throwout bearing, these just twist into the fork, and they'll go opposite directions, like that. And then we can slide the clutch fork into place. Now, the spring clips are going to be a little bit more difficult to get on this clutch or this throwout bearing because it's a little different than the stock one, but it is the same process. It just locks into the channel on the throwout bearing. You can see the little channel right here. So I'm just going to get it over the ledge. And there you go. With a new clutch fork assembly put together, we can slide it into place. You can see I've greased the pivot point and the input shaft cover, as well as a little bit of grease inside of the throwout bearing. So we'll slide it into that rubber boot. And then slide the throwout bearing onto the input shaft. And then we just need to press the clutch fork onto that pivot ball, and it just pops into place. Move it back and forth a little bit, and we're ready to move on to the next step. With the clutch fully installed, we can now reinstall the transmission. Now, I did grease the splines of the clutch disc before I installed that, and the splines on the input shaft of the transmission. So now we just need to get this level with the engine, get it on the studs, and then we can get those bolts reinstalled and torqued down, and then we can get everything else reinstalled. After a bunch of wiggling, prying, and mostly cursing, we have finally got the transmission back in place so we can install the new Bellhousing bolts and nuts. And then once we have those on, we'll get everything reinstalled. If you guys need the torque specs, I'm gonna leave everything down in the description so you don't have to sift through this video to find them. The torque specs for those Bellhousing bolts are 37 foot-pounds, and we're also gonna be using blue Loctite. So let's get those reinstalled and get this thing put back together. For the bottom bolt on this starter, don't forget the ground cable here that we took off before we insert the bolt. Before we reinstall the transmission mount, go ahead and slide the pins for the shifter carrier back into their spot and lock them into place, and then we can install them out. The 4 bolts holding this black section of the transmission mount in place need to be torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. For the last portion of the mount, the 2 nuts on the inside need to be torqued to 30 foot-pounds, and then the 4 bolts on the outside that go to the car need to be torqued to 48 foot-pounds. We can also reinstall the front pipe mount, and these 2 bolts need to be torqued to 17 foot-pounds. Next step is going to be reconnecting that shifter linkage, and then reinstalling the washer and cotter pin. Then we can slide the boot back into place. We're ready to slide the drive shaft back into place. Make sure these splines line up. Should be pretty easy to slide right in. And then we can reinstall the 2 bolts with some blue Loctite for the center support. And we'll torque these down to 35 foot-pounds. Line up the marks you made for the rear diff connection, and then we can get the bolts reinstalled with some blue Loctite. And we'll get these torqued to 57 foot-pounds. With the drive shaft in place, we can reinstall the exhaust components that we took off. If you've gotten this far, I'm assuming you know how to do that. So we can move on to the next step, which is refilling the transmission with new gear oil. To refill the transmission, we've got that fill plug removed, and we're gonna need about 2.2 quarts of gear oil. I'm gonna be using Motul Gear 300. If you don't happen to have a spout on your container like this, you may need to use a pump to pump the fluid into that fill hole. But with this, I'm able to just stick that in there, tip this up, and then squeeze the fluid in. When the fluid starts to come out of that fill hole, you know that you've got the correct amount in there. All right, now we can reinstall that plug, get it torqued to 27 foot-pounds, get the under panels reinstalled, and then we can move up to the top. Back on the top side, we need to make sure that the starter gets reconnected along with the ground cable and 2 connections that we unplugged from the transmission and the slave cylinder. And the last thing is the battery. That pretty much covers it, guys. Make sure to double check all of the bolts to ensure that they are torqued to spec and that you have everything put back together on the top side as well. This is one of the more involved installs. So if you're doing this yourself for the first time, I highly suggest you grab a friend that's done this before. It'll really help to speed up the process and minimize any headaches. I did have to retap that hole that I was having an issue with when I was taking the transmission out, the starter bolts. But luckily, when I went to reinstall the transmission, that bolt seems to be holding just fine. So I got lucky there. If you guys are interested, I will leave all of the parts, the torque specs, and tips as well down in the description. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Make sure to follow the break-in procedure for the clutch that should be outlined by the manufacturer. I cannot wait to get this car back out on the track and beat on it. Huge shout out to XClutch for sending me the clutch. Can't wait to see how it feels. But yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.